G'day legends, I hope you are having a fantastic day and so far you are having a brilliant week. Now legends, of course as always we have a lot to go over. We have the usual stuff. We'll look at the battlefield, we'll look at geolocations, we'll look at maps, we'll look at some incidents that have occurred in the past 24 hours. But the main meat of this video today is going to be about these peace proposals, but also about the gulf that is being created between where the US, where Europe are sitting. Europe's lack of strategy, but why there is this fear as well about Russia within Europe and why some of it may not make sense on the surface. And we're going to dig a little bit into that and why Europe, it is foundationally changing in a world that is going from a unipole with the US at the top with a massive relationship with themselves, their allies in Europe, to a world of multipolar power. We're going to talk about that, a little bit complex, but I think you will really enjoy it. So stick with me. Of course, we'll look at the proposals, what has happened in 24 hours with the US, Russian delegations, and what we think, if anything, is going to become of this. So legends, of course, there's a lot to go over in this. The first thing I want to talk about is this. So you see this image right here. We see the bridge of a ship that has been impacted by something definitely explosive. And what we know is there's been at least 2 confirmed incidents in the last 96 hours of Ukrainian drones striking what they deem as Russian Shadow Fleet vessels. Now, what I should have added more yesterday, and I will now, is at the end of the day, these are civilian vessels with civilian crew being targeted by highly explosive drones. Noel reports he had this on his Telegram today. A Russian tanker, the Mid-Volga 2, was attacked by fixed-wing drones, possibly an FP-1 or Luizzi. At least 2 crew members were injured, including captain and second engineer, after shrapnel from the strike hit the ship's bridge. Russian media claimed the drone came from the direction of Odessa and was armed with fragmentation munitions. Now, others have said that this potentially is a false flag, so Russia could then further tighten down on Ukrainian shipping in the Black Sea. Now, what do we know at this point in time? Well, all that we know is that Ukraine has attacked definitely 2, maybe 3 vessels 3 days ago, potentially another one here. But what we have spoken of is shipping in the Black Sea is incredibly important for both Ukraine and Russia, but it's Ukraine's only access to the sea. Turkey, they have authorities investigating this right now. And as far as shutting down or striking vessels in the Black Sea, we have seen, of course, Ukraine doing it from Russian Black Sea Fleet to now these civilian Shadow Fleet vessels. But we do know that Russia has a greater capacity to do that as well, with the Black Sea Fleet is still the majority there, as well as land-based systems too. And as we've said, this is likely going to get more and more gloves off in this region, if then there isn't some level of deal made again. So let's talk about the battlefield, attritions, concessions. And of course, this will link further to the peace proposals that we'll speak about later on. Now, this heartbreaking story came out from Reuters. They speak about these young Ukrainians, but again, this is absolutely on both sides of this war. One of the primary reasons people don't like me online is because I treat other humans all as humans. I'm not willing to just dehumanize one whole state worth of people. But let's look at this. A band of brothers. Now, the war crushed a cohort of young Ukrainians, and this is tragic. It is heartbreaking, and God bless these young guys. That Reuters, they followed fortunes of a group of raw recruits who enlisted as part of Ukraine's drive to refresh its depleted ranks. None of them are still fighting. They tracked Broshkov and 10 of his comrades, who are among a dozen raw recruits that received a crash course in warfare at a military training camp in spring before being deployed to the front. I don't know what's happening with all of this fantastic NATO-level training that is meant to be going on. None of the 11 are still fighting. 4 have been wounded, 3 are missing in action, 2 are absent without leave, 1 fell sick, and another tragically took his own life. Now, Reuters was unable to contact the other recruits who attended the spring training camp and couldn't determine whether the 11 cases reflect broader levels of attrition in the conflict, which has dragged on for almost 4 years. I'll answer that for you now, Reuters. Yes, it does. And we know that a lot of people are marked down as missing or AWOL to skew some figures into the higher ups as well, because there's still money being paid also. Let's look at this. Mr. Clement Molan. He tweets, giving away the remaining part of Donetsk Oblast to Russia without a fight cannot be accepted by Ukraine because it still contains most of the fortifications and 5 cities. So you see where the front line is sitting around about right here. And of course, this white line, that's indicating the remaining part of Donetsk. Just imagine giving all this away for free. Russia wouldn't give anything in return for the peace that we already know will be broken as soon as they occupy the whole area. So what Mr. Molin is getting at here is look at all the fortifications, the cities, Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, that sit in here. And if this was given away, then the front line just bumps without a fight to behind all of these fortifications. And if Russia then go, we want to continue going, you're behind all the fortifications. But as far as this idea that Russia wouldn't give anything in return, if there is a peace deal and this is signed here, say the US 28-point peace plan, we've seen that that is weighted far more neutral than other plans. It's slightly towards Russia's side. There are then security guarantees in this. There are then economic concessions that Russia needs to make. And as far as what would it give, well, the war would stop. Because as far as I'm seeing this area is going to be taken one way or another. It's either going to be completely devastated through here over 12 months or more, or it's going to move in this fashion. But I do agree with the premise here of you do need, if this is going to be signed off, what is stopping a false flag or just a blatant further attack beyond these regions? But it is interesting to look at, and this is what a lot of people are talking about. But what I see is, well, it's going to be done militarily or the other way. But the idea that the original US plan was completely weighted in Russia's favour is incorrect. The European plan, well, it's laughable at best. They obviously have no clue how the battlefield is, or they do have a clue how the battlefield is, and what they're trying to do is, what I'll talk about later, is a strategy to try and reduce Russia's power, not caring who, Ukraine, remains in the way. Now, Kirill Dmitriev, he says this, is tweeted a photograph of course, himself, Mr. Witkoff here, saying productive. Now, meetings with the US-Russian delegations, these lasted about 5 hours. Now, I have little hope at all that these are going to find any middle ground that could deliver a lasting end to the war. The primary question you have to ask yourself in this is, does Russia believe it's going to be in a better position? And as long as Russia calculate that they will be in a better position in the coming months in time to either enforce its demands now, then its demands will not decrease. They will not make then further concession. Of course, the war is highly expensive for Russia, so they will, of course, entertain these ideas. But as far as territory, West involvement, NATO, that's not going to move. What I will say about this is, if Russia's calculating, which I believe is calculating correctly, that they will start winning and they will be winning and winning faster through this, that the Ukrainian position will deteriorate more quickly in the past 6-12 months if the war continues, it is more likely that when this stage of peace proposals, this stage of talks then comes to an end in a failure, and when then everyone comes back to the table, the Russian demands will have increased. And people have noticed this from, oh, this deal's worse than back in 2022. Yes, the war is looking that way as well. So let's have a look at the maps. Of course, we have Ukraine in the center of the screen, the capital of Kyiv. Red area is occupied since 22. Purple since 2014. Red check on this map. That is indicating ground that Russia is confirmed to have made over the past 24 hours, due to this being the Ukrainian map with, of course, massive biases included into this. First place we're going to come down into is in the southern region, all this southern part down in here around Huliapol. This is the area that we've spoken about that does concern us the most. Amount of ground that could be made in here relatively quickly is a lot, even by the linear warfare mouth breathers. What I want to show you is, let's just step back. Do I still have Clement Molin's map? It doesn't show it fantastically, but you can see where this is here. Of course, these yellow parts, this is the fortifications. You can see my concern. Zaporizhia right here, where the southern front is moving and increasingly moving quickly, you could see how this could flank behind massive amounts of fortifications and make a huge amount of ground in the direction of Zaporizhia very quickly. And of course, this further has any military then taking back of ground by Ukraine and victories in here, because this was the weak point when the 23 offensive kicked off. more and more unlikely. So let's talk about the Gulipol frontline Dobropilia region. So we have Mr. Suryak maps. Now, he's showing that the last 40 hours that Russia has made further movements in this direction and have captured half of then Dobropilia. This is Gulipol right here. So ground being made, but further to Dobropilia and all the way down through in the direction first sort of break-ins into Gulipol. Next map, that Russian army took full control over Dobropilia. Now, I believe this to be correct as these three geolocations right here. Again, this is very rough, but it's just to paint the picture close enough to these three geolocations. We did see Russian flags being flown in this area. Now, again, this is definitely grey zone. Why does this map annoy us in this region? Because we know that Ukrainian forces in the south, they are having a lack of communications, therefore using the deep state map for their own then situational awareness of the battlefield. And Dobropilia sector in here, let's go, there's one right about here, some 6 kilometers behind the line here as well. If we come to the north of here, Tikhi, which is still not shown, although there's many geolocations in here, to some 10 kilometers behind the line. This is why numbers are starting to trickle through. I'm just waiting on Suryak's figures. The difference between the deep state's figures, AMK, Suryak, is going to be a lot for the month of November. Okay, let's just move to the north of here a little bit, and we're looking for Andriivka Vidrane region. And we typically call this like the west of Velika Novosibirsk, just to give us a point to sort of work off. So, last 3 days, Russian army captured the rest of the forest area of Veliko Mykolaiivka and positions north of Vidrane and Danilivka. So, we'll come up some parts of Velika, the one I tried to pronounce, Danilivka areas, Vidrane, that this whole sector further coming under control. You can see just the difference in how this front line looks. This is Tikhi right up in here where I showed you that some 10 kilometers difference between these maps. Let's move to the west of here. Now, ignore that red check for now. Let's come to Orikhiv, of course, where the 23 offensive was then launched, made about 8 kilometers. We see this. During the last week, the Russian army secured latest advances south of Novodanilivka and expanded the salient westwards. So moving Novodanilivka and then expanding west as well. Like we talk, if you move forward, you then need to move adjacent in both ways to not get then at least run a risk of being vertically enveloped. This is something that does tell me about the Russian drone advantage, superiority that we see on the battlefield. We do know that Russia has a superiority of drones at the moment, but what we do see is Russia is able to, from Kursk to Kupiansk to Pokrovsk to other sectors, vertically envelop. We have not seen Ukraine be able to vertically envelop Russian forces when there are multiple areas that are at high risk of this. Let's then move further west. We have, of course, Stepnohursk, Kamyanskaya front, of course, this area leading up to Zaporizhia. Let's just have a measurement of this right here, some 21 kilometers. I do remember when I was sitting in Zap, and this front hasn't moved that much since, you could hear artillery from the city. But what we're looking at today is Suryak saying that there's basically been very large movements here in the last 3 days. In the last 6 days, Russian army continued developing encirclement around Stepnohursk. Russian forces entered again the southern part of the locality. We know this front has been a little bit forward and back. Then the next day, he says, last 2 days, Russian army practically surrounded Ukraine army inside of Stepnohursk, which is in the process of being fully taken. So we can have a look. The best areas to get where this road is, where the island boys of Stepnohursk are hanging out, that he's saying they've moved right up into here and then around on the eastern side of Stepnohursk in this direction as well. We know there's been movement from this red check. And then, situation, this final update, Russian army entered the high buildings inside Stepnohursk and captured a series of positions southeast of the locality. So this area is somewhat moving again. We'll keep an eye on it, that we see that this should be heavily defendable for Ukraine due to the leverage of the Dnieper River, but as well this whole southern area is coming into like a basin of envelopment at the moment. Definitely keep an eye on this sector. Let's move into Pokrovsk. We have northern Pokrovsk and Pokrovsk actual Minograd front. We see red check in this deep state map. Of course, other maps still showing that there's no Russians at all in Pokrovsk. And we do see that there are, of course, Ukrainian accounts that are desperate to save the narrative, because we saw in the center of Pokrovsk, Russian forces fly a Russian national flag. And then we've seen that the 425th Separate Assault Scala published an AI-generated image pretending to be in the same area to push back on that Russian footage. It was debunked by Deep State. So Deep State themselves calling out this too. But we do know there are Russians in the center of Pokrovsk walking around, and the fighting is well beyond that as this does grow into a further squeeze every single day and has all the hallmarks of becoming an absolute military catastrophe on here. Not only that, it is a informational turning point, in my opinion. Will this be a strategical, tactical turning point? No. Informationally, absolutely, I think it will. I think there's no hiding how desperate the situation is and will become on this sector. So we see Moskovskoye down to the south of Minigrad, more Russian ground being made. Let's have a look at the Syriac maps. He's showing that the southern part of here along the rail, which is now basically all grey, that has then been made by the Russian forces under control. To then the west of this whole then envelopment towards Harashne that the Russians are making ground. We do know from geolocations, other maps, and of course where the ground is lying here, moving in that Harashne front, forming this into then that tunnel exit that we do speak about, but also to reach out to the west does help leverage down further then southwest and to the east around Dobropilia sector for the next steps beyond this. And then the final map here to the northwest that the Russians from basically the Rodyanske front line, Krasny Liman here, have made ground on the side, the northwestern side of Minigrad. And as we speak about, just squeezing on the remainder of this area. And at the moment, this area as well is being held, pinned by FPV drones, and then just completely decimated by FABs all the way from 250s to 3 thousands. To the north of here, Shakhovka, we see further then red check showing this is Russian ground being made. Island boys of Shakhovka here too. Let's have a look. Sorry, incorrect map. We see Syriac, AMK, they've been telling a vastly different story on here for basically the entirety of that northern offensive that then pushed out. The Russian army captured new positions between Shakhovka and Novoshakovka, thus reaching the first houses of the second locality again. So we have Shakhovka, then we have Novoshakovka, and him saying between Novoshakovka, they're filling in this sector in here. So just wait out on this. These maps have always shown vastly different. Then to the east of here, we have Konstantinivka as well, where these have shown different as well, especially around this basin down in here around Yamblanivka, Kulinbuk area, where this is showing still grey zone. Where we're looking today is around Konstantinivka actual, that he is saying over the last 8 days, the Russian forces began to complete control of the trench system in the southeastern outskirts. So not only a break into here, but in the southeastern part. We do see some grey zone in here, but we do know many people are throwing up warning signs of how severe the situation may become on this sector. Right, let's head to the north. Firstly, let's talk about Kupiansk, because there has been some warnings for the Russians up in here. So the first map that we have is in the Kupiansk pocket. That there's still, he says, situation in the center is fluid, Petropavlivka, that there has been some further assaults in this direction. But what I want to speak about is Kupiansk actual. So we see here that there's been large amounts of Ukrainian ground being made back by the Ukrainian forces around Kupiansk as they have broken in to then the city, or re-broken in. And Mr. AMK, he says the same. Kupiansk being clarified, the situation could soon reach a critical point for the Russian formations in the western part of the city. So where the Russians are lying in these western parts, keep an eye on that as Ukraine has pushed back in. And that does, for me, meet the threshold of saying that there has been successful advancement on these western sides. Let's continue pushing up. Now, there's been a little bit of clarity around this, although it's still hard to know. We've seen the Russian MOD, they've said, at least to my knowledge, that Vovchansk has come under their control. AMK, he has pushed back, I believe, and said, no, it's not completely under control, but there's further advancements in this sector. So let's have a look at this. We've seen, though, over the past weeks that Russia has really reignited Vovchansk, and he's making ground through here, confirmed by geolocations, multiple opposing maps. So 2 days ago, small bit of ground being made up in this sector, nothing to write home about, just right down in here. But then today, that At the end of November, Ukraine army withdrew from the last parts of the town of Vovchansk under its control, ending 19 months of fighting. In the last 2 days, Russian army completely occupied the southern part of the town, completing its total control for the first time since September 22. In addition, Russian forces continued the offensive to the south, taking control of the northern part of Vilcha. So we see, this is Vilcha right in here. They've taken over the remaining western parts and then control into some parts of Vilcha as well. And we have spoken about it. There's others speaking about this. AMK is the one that put me onto it. Now I'm seeing other mappers that where the waterway runs basically all the way down through this, that all of this could quickly come under control. And I was thinking about this last night. In some sort of land swap deal, how close, if this is the easiest area to just get kilometre squares, how close is this area to something like this in a 1-for-1 kilometre square swap? Now, we know this is far more important than that, but how does that look to a highly transactional leader like President Trump? Let's go up into Sumy in the northern area, where we did see there's been some recent Russian advance around Andriivka, Oleksivka too. Then AMK, he's further saying this, retaking the locality of Oleksivka. Again, this hasn't met our threshold, but it's worth mentioning while we are there. Let's come down into Seversk and we'll work our way down. So, of course, we have this Seversk pocket that is being formed. Okay, what I want to show you is to the south of here, around Zanivka, Svato-Pokrovsky, where there's a large difference in these maps. What we see here is this is a Russian soldier right here clearing these areas in the footage. Of course, I can't show the footage. This is geolocated close enough to where I've put this dot here, some 6.5 kilometers behind even the grey zone in this sector. So absolutely keep an eye on that. What we do know, AMK Surek, they have showed that the Russians are pushing from Vreminka and Berezhny in the direction of Seversk over the past months. Seversk itself, this is showing basically where that geolocation is by the Suryak map. Then we come into the Liman front line, and we're talking about, if I believe correctly, Stavke. So you see Stavke right in here. This was reported last week as coming under Russian control. Today, Surek is saying that Ukraine army launched a counterattack and they've recaptured Stavke sitting in here. Again, this is an area with a lot of grey zone and a lot of unknowns in this sector. An area which we haven't seen move for a very long time. Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar, Yamlanivka front line. Vilolobivka front line. This is where we're looking today. And according to Mr. Suryak maps, situation on this front, following the capture of Mayske, the Russian army continued advancing westwards, taking over control of areas to the west of Chasiv Yar. So just above Shavone and Mayske come under control, as we reported on yesterday, that there's been more movement in this direction, which does make sense for envelopment of Konstantinivka, as we're seeing the break-in at the base of that. You want to keep then your enemy opposing force engaged at the base of development as you build the flanks around. This is the case for the DRGs working in line with FPV's, FAB's larger strategic picture. Right, so the news on the political front for the past weeks has been about these peace proposals. Now, I don't like this idea of calling them negotiations because no one's negotiating. Peace proposal, talks, probably more just having a yarn, because as I see at the moment, no one's willing to really make concessions. Where Russia is sitting is far closer to the reality of the battlefield than where Ukraine is sitting. Even if you're a linear warfare bro, that you can predict, you can extrapolate Russia will take this in X amount of months, X amount of years. But you can't do that for Ukraine back to the 1991 borders. So at the end of the day, you're bragging about losing more quickly. And what we say is US has far more leverage over Ukraine and Europe than it does over Russia. Of course, all this comes down to Europe has a much smaller domestic sort of image of the world. The US, being a great power, has an international vision. And where they're looking at is the Donbass means nothing for us. Yeah, the credibility of our defense may mean something. This is why we're pinning it on Biden's war, blah, blah, blah. What matters to us is where is Russia moving in relation to China? And of course, Russia will remain a strategic power, strategic nuclear power. And at the end of the day, not only have those assets been completely untouched, it's become more dangerous due to then, as any state has further economic or military worries, the risk of a use of a system like that becomes high. But none of those strategic systems have been then struck or decreased at all. What we're talking about is ICBMs, submarines, Tu-160. Now, let's have a look at this. This is from the BBC. No concessions and no compromises found yet. Many in Kyiv and around Europe have warned that Russia's best option is to play for time and keep grinding its advance. And again, we see this because, one, it's what Russia's doing. Secondly, when we see Zelensky or Macron or whoever, callous, then, or they're just trying to delay this, you go, well, then if they're doing that and if you're then going against them for doing it, it must mean at times in their favour. If you were saying, if Zelensky or Kaya or von der Leyen came out and said, Russia's trying to wrap this up quickly, what that would say to me is, therefore, you don't want it to wrap up quickly because of the sanctions that have been imposed. Short of being forced to surrender, it seems a nice outcome will be one of the worst ones for Ukraine. No concessions whatsoever by Russia. No indication the US has already dropped a tougher tone against Moscow's unwillingness to budge. But a clear impression that the US-Russian relationship is growing ever more cordial, like even its partners risk being left out of negotiations that they would be mostly impacted by. Why would they be risking leaving out? Because they are not interested in negotiating. But that relationship, I agree, is definitely growing between the US and Russia. We'll talk more about that and why, which of course to do with China later on, but as well, being left out. What I see is that age-old, if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. And we see then Twitter users like Mr. War Monitor here going, why are the US, Russia and China meeting to decide the fate of Europe? Have you forgotten the most powerful continent on planet Earth? Firstly, that is just now incorrect, maybe at one stage. But the question shouldn't be posed, why are they meeting to decide the fate of Europe? It should be posed to Europe in the form of, how have your politicians let your economies, your manufacturing, your sovereignty erode so badly that once great powers are now irrelevant and other powers are making decisions basically for you? Of course, the sovereignty of Europe has massively declined with this war and then America taking over those pillars for Europe. Now, the US, they can make decisions for Europe because they are essentially now a vassal. If you look at sovereignty on the three pillars of sovereignty due to trade, military, and energy, of course, this war has not then increased European sovereignty. Of course, ideologically, cutting off Russian oil and gas, ideologically, may have been the right thing to do. But does that increase your sovereignty when now you're reliant on the US for all of this? Your weapon systems, your manufacturing, you can't keep up a war, so then you're reliant on the US. You then see the problem in this. That is exactly why this is happening. And again, I'm sure the US would love to say, you guys take it over. Why? Because Europe can't do it without the US. At the end of the day, the US, they can push as hard as they will want, and I don't see the other choices that Europe has, especially around this. A lot of it is to do with money. And even if this did get freed up, where would the money be going? To the US. The European Central Bank refuses to provide a backstop for the $163 billion loan to Ukraine. Of course, this was seen as the way out of this, was the frozen Russian assets, loan against that, reparations loan, if you will. Of course, European states love to talk about reparations for war without then looking in the mirror ever, but they concluded the European Commission proposal violated its mandate, citing multiple officials, according to Brussels, difficulty in raising a loan against the central bank assets. What we do know is US money is done for this war. European money, either they're going to have to undermine all of their economies or they're going to have to massively tax their citizens further, already in some of the highest tax areas in the world. What I will say is, as unpopular as it would be to tax those citizens, I think in the long term, it is a much safer option. That said, in countries that practice democracy, like within the EU, I say practice there on purpose, is increasing those taxes. You can just get vastly different officials in. And of course, the intelligence services within Europe, it's going to be very difficult to start trying to undermine all of these. May be easier than Romania, Slovakia, or Hungary. It's going to be much more difficult in these larger states. It will be done. We've seen France then do it, but that money, we know there's no funding beyond like February. Where is that happening? And this is where this leverage, if Russia's going, you guys don't have any money in a couple of months, why are we going to be making concessions right now? Again, it's not saying it's right or wrong. We're talking about the reality of the world. Now, this is from the Wall Street Journal in article published, Trump's push to end the Ukraine war is sowing fresh fear about NATO's future. And this ties into what we're going to speak about later with then, and sorry, I've got an itch in my nose. I'm not in the bloody capital with the boys on the powder, about What is Europe's strategy here? What are they actually doing? And the lack of strategy is concerning, but it's not just incompetence. There is more of a plan somewhat. If it weren't for the Europeans, a French official said earlier in the day, Putin and Trump would have reached an agreement a long time ago. And I think that's where Trump is like, you guys do your own thing. If you're not willing to work with us at all, we're going to make our own proposals, which is coming back to this, that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. The Americans and Europeans are coming to the peace proposal from two different angles. The Americans are seeing it for what it is, and the Europeans are living in fantasy land with the fucking unicorns, somewhat. Europe sees Russia rearming and is worried about next year. The Americans are thinking much more short term. Let's get this process over the line, ceasefire deal, get Ukraine back on its feet and cobble together some sort of cold peace for the next year or two. The differentiated is explaining Europeans' proximity to the battlefield and the feeling of what might be next, whereas the Americans are more worried about China for a long-term threat, which is a paradox to what you said, that the Americans are thinking short-term, yet long-term Chinese threat. I somewhat get what she's getting at here, but the proximity here for the Europeans, could you really say that Europe has pulled all stops for this as well? Most European political and military leaders agree that Putin's ambition is to rebuild Russia's imperial reach. Standing in the way is NATO and its mutual defence clause, which states that an attack on one is an attack on all. Now, the leaders here, most of them agree publicly. They're going, yep, the ambition is to further invade, remake the Soviet Union, blah, blah, blah. But what is that actually built on? Because there's no comments of this. There's no leaked intelligence reports of wanting to do this. And the biggest one is Russia has not shown the conventional power to be able to do this. That's the biggest one. If Russia was moving at 35 kilometers a day through Ukraine and still building more tanks, building more shells, fuck, yeah, maybe they will. What were we seeing? No. This is where this is being used informationally rather than reality. Then we'll talk about why, because they don't actually have a strategy further on and they're trying to save basically a dying empire that is now just built on tourism and hopes and dreams of what was historically relevant. Putin knows he can't defeat NATO in a head-on fight, especially given how badly the war in Ukraine has gone for the Russian forces. His hopes is to defeat it politically and undermining its cohesiveness. This is where I see it. This goes back to the Europeans. You stub your toe and it's Putin's fault. Why has there been an undermining in the cohesiveness in the EU and NATO? Okay, maybe Russia is a factor in this. Maybe Putin's a factor in this. What's more of a factor is going against your very own foundations. Now, it was well known. You look at the Extending Russia, who, it's actually funny because the person who wrote some of this worked for the same think tank funded by the Europeans and the Americans to write that. Absolutely, they had as a risk of extending Russia, Ukraine's joining NATO, as what would it do? It would risk NATO cohesion. So you knew this. Let's not act like this is a new thing. The US's latest plan would go a long way towards dividing NATO by proposing what would amount to an amnesty for Russia for the invasion, allowing it to re-enter the G8 club of rich countries and pursue joint economic development plans with the US in the Arctic. What I'll say is, regardless of what the Europeans do here, I reckon the US and Russia are going to move ahead anyway. It will create huge divisions between the transatlantic partnership, politically for Russia on the cusp of winning. What I've said is, if at the end of this war you see massive fractures or further fractures in NATO and the EU, that is a far bigger win than even Putin's wet dreams were. But is that because of Russia? No. It's because of internal politics made over decades of shit decisions in those states. Musala, a German academic, said such moves to reintegrate Russia into the global economy would make it harder for European politicians to persuade voters to back higher defence spending. Has gained recent notoriety for laying out how Russia might go about testing NATO to ultimately cause it to unravel. His booklet, If Russia Wins, has been making the rounds in European capitals. It helps explain Europe's anxiety about NATO and the US administration. Of course, the frictions between NATO in the US, that isn't just a new thing. But of course, this war has exacerbated it. Is it the foundation of it? No, it is not. What we do know is the Europeans don't have a clear strategy forward. Now, this is a great article here by Jacobin. Now, it's titled, Europe's Leaders Have No Strategy for Peace. The end of US primacy, so first in line, if you will, represents a far more dramatic loss of status for Europeans than it does for the Americans. Okay, so what we're talking about is this movement into the world of multipoles that we're seeing, that the loss for Europeans is going to be greater than for the Americans, because the Americans will still be an equal. But without the US, where does that leave Europe? Caught off guard by new proposals that halt the war in Ukraine, European leaders have rejected the idea of Kyiv giving up territory. What's less clear is how they imagine making their red lines into a reality. And this is what I've spoken about. The European plans, the Ukrainian plans, that relies on military victory because they do not have the political or economic leverage on Russia at this point in time to do so. That they are pulling on all the levers, and the remaining levers either are incredibly painful for themselves or are limited in the 2021, 22 sanctions package coming in. Now, it's going to be a lot of reading in this, but I'm not going to go through all of it. You should go and read it. It is clear by now that European leaders prefer the war in Ukraine to continue, that they fear peace, that many believe Europe is already at war and they seem gun-ho to turn it into a shooting war, and they are obsessed with inflicting defeat on Russia. Far less clear is why they think this way. Now, this is something we've been speaking about. They are more interested in having a further impact on Russia or a defeat on Russia than peace and the survival of Ukraine. Kaya Kalas literally pointed this out. Priority number 1 is to impact Russia. Priority number 2 is the best future for Ukraine. That's where I say that this isn't then just incompetence, it's leading to malicious politics. We're living through, excuse my German, I know someone behind the scenes who helps me is German, the Zeitenwende, that'll do, Zeitenwende, with the frisson of which this word is uttered in English media. You'd think it means Germans like war again. You'd be forgiven for thinking this when the Budweiser promotional video, torchlit ceremony or Lithuanian forest to the Lord of the Rings, that you're ready for war. But Zeitenwende means end of an era, if you will, end of an epoch. Rubio stated the unipolar moment had been an anomaly, and the world was reverting to a multipolar order with a room for Russia and China as great powers. Now, it may not have, we're moving to a multipolar world. You will have, of course, states who are incredibly powerful, but you will have states that are a Schwerpunkt, for a German word, that are a center of gravity for regions. So you may have Russia won't be the great power that China or the US will be, but it could be the center of gravity for that region of the world through in Eurasia, and you may have other ones pop up also. Since Rubio's clinical diagnosis, we've been watching a repeat reel of Europe's foreign policy establishment having the rug pulled from under their feet. Hegseth Brokesk broadside of the MSC, Trump, J.D. Vance picking on Zelensky in the Oval Office, French announcements of peacekeepers falling apart within days, Trump summiting with Putin in Alaska, followed by a gaggle of European leaders lined up at his desk like children summoned to the principal's office, and European leaders cheering the US president calling Russia a paper tiger, only to realise that he implied they would have to fight this animal alone. On November the 19th, news broke of a US-brokered peace deal imposing stringent conditions on Ukraine, saying we don't really care about the Europeans. And you see from the US officials, there's further insult to injury, and where we go back of why the Europeans are being left out of this, because they're not willing to be at the table. Why are they not? We'll go through this. Americans mostly saw the unidentifying spectacle. Europeans, meanwhile, have been watching their elites succumb to rearmament frenzy characterised by shrill fear-mongering, saying things along the lines of, our last summer at peace. And of course, just like the BBC one went through, that then what's next is Russia's full invasion of NATO, the EU, even if there is no evidence to show capacity to do this or then willingness. What explains this frenzy among European elites? What explains their sudden readiness to throw strict fiscal rules to the wind, alienate citizens, and yet more austerity, and then scold them for their discontent? So austerity here is increased, then taxing, decreased public spending. Scold them for their discontent, meekly forfeit their positions on trade, or suspend democracy itself, as we're seeing the suspension of democracy here if you have any different ideas to then that we need further war. Why revive militarist propaganda tropes reeking of early 20th century rot? And I was going to actually post in my Telegram a poll of, does this war end in surrender of a state? Does it end in negotiation? Or does it end with a shooting war between Russia and the European part of NATO? If you want further reading on what then this gentleman here is talking about, I couldn't recommend highly reading John Mearsheimer's The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. Highly relevant, and you'll get a good idea of how great states think vastly different to minor states. When the end of the Cold War and the United States found itself in a single remaining superpower, theories like Francis Fukuyama's End of History or Wolfowitz Doctrine turned the unipolar reality into a mandate. So Fukuyama thought that the end of this, with one superpower, therefore, it's the end of history, that you won't have any more war. US global hegemony was to be preserved at any cost, and its military would have to be able to defeat challenges anywhere in the world, and if need be, simultaneously. Regional powers, lagging far behind the US militarily and economically, would have to bend to American primacy. According to American military alliances, above all NATO, they were expanded, and from North Africa to Central Asia, eventual forever wars were launched. So to keep this primacy, to keep this hegemony dominance, that would be preserved at any cost, often in the name of liberal democracy, but of course was not that. Then in the last decade, a new generation of American thinkers began to critique the pursuit of dominance as unsustainable, detrimental to national security, and ruinous for democracy and society's well-being. More of an isolationist view of this, and that you're going to have other great powers rise. Still, rude Trump administration demands that NATO members spend more on defence shouldn't have been surprising. The Americans had told their European allies to increase military spending in the 1950s, and in the 1950s contribute to containing Soviet Union, and since the 1990s to co-fund the joint project in global primacy. Yet, America has also drawn enormous advantage from its military presence in Europe, crown jewel and key hub of its global primacy. This is something that the isolationists don't understand, that America, if it's isolated, is at the end of the day just a very powerful island. What NATO gives America is an arm of power into historically the most powerful region as Europe, but also an arm of power through, say, Turkey and further nations into Eurasia, Middle East region too. So it is still important for them. If they're just isolated off here, their actual scope of influence is massively limited. And it does threaten that Europe will eventually be soaked into larger powers, be it Russia, be it China, without the US. Of course, US with very limited Western allies, as Western countries are only a very small minority of people and states in the world, when we're talking just population figures, but also reducing in global power economically, manufacturing, etc. If European leaders are now grasping for desperate measures, like high-stakes gamble of borrowing against frozen Russian assets, is because the end of US primacy represents a far more dramatic loss of status for the Europeans than it does for the Americans. So America having a reduction is catastrophic for the Europeans who are reliant on them, rather than what it just may look like for the US. The US remains superpower, one of the most indisputable poles of a multipolar order. But what should Europe be on its own in terms of military might and power politics? A great power. Do the European citizens want that? Do they also want the great power rivalry that would inevitably come with it, which would poison their democracy, exacerbate inequality, and threaten peace the world over? And that's the thing, with a great power like this, it does exacerbate inequality. And of course, you come with the great power competition too. But where is the pole of European great power? They can't decide on what softness of toilet paper to have within the EU, because you've got these 27 states, none of which are great powers within this, or together could be, but they can't decide on anything within that. That's where that falls apart. But then what happens beyond this also? But the US, of course, becoming more multipole, it has a huge impact on Europe. But it's not out of fear of an attack by Russia on NATO states. Speaking of, then why they have this view. Europe's political influence like to tell a story in which Putin looms as a berserk and ravenous conqueror of worlds, attacking one country after another, in the process, against all logic, becoming even stronger. An ogre, in the words of Macron, a predator at our gates who has to keep feeding to survive. But does this align with reality? That it's just ravenous through becoming more powerful, taking over, and Paris is next. Actually, I will say, I guess the Afghanis did beat the Soviets, so Paris actually might be very difficult to take over. Big brain thinking. But it just doesn't align. Why is this? This is also how the Brussels think tank Bruegel explained it. Russia will attack Europe. Why? Because it possesses so many pieces of that weapons category. But this argument lacks any evidence, even from leaked Russian sources. Clues of modern or Russian history, and above all, good strategic reason. Never mind NATO's collective armies are far superior to Russia's, which is exceedingly well documented. So this is what we say, is the actual evidence of wanting to do, the willingness to do this is completely limited, other than the Europeans saying this is what's going to happen. And militarily, the actual capacity to do this doesn't seem to be there. For much of this year, Europe's elected representatives, still awkward in their newly martial bearing, beat around the bush when asked about Russia's attack plans. Some showed passive-aggressive resistance against the enormous rearmament and a comprehensive militarisation of politics, the economy, and society as supposedly Europe's only salvation. The EU's loan for arms facility SAFE, which European Commissioner Ursula von der Leyen announced the great fanfare in spring, ended up undersubscribed, with Germany backing out late in the game. NATO members paid lip service to the 5% of GDP in defence spending Trump demanded. A lot of this was creative bookkeeping, that repairing bridges or investing AI then counted in this. But of course, you get a lot more bang for your buck than just making a tank out of those. So it's a lot of that is being creative bookkeeping. Hegemony in Eurasia. European leaders' reaction to Israel and the US illegal attacks on Iran in June further clarified the motives behind Europe's neo-Bellicism. If you will, emphasis on military solutions, not political solutions. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz thanked Israel for doing Europe's dirty work, and von der Leyen pontificated about Israel's right to self-defense. Ostensibly, so seeming true but is not, because Iran failed to return to the negotiating table, the action was in fact a show of anticipatory obedience to Trump. Europe's neo-Bellicism is about dominance, not protection from danger. Unease over security-related questions can often be a stand for in deeper concerns about status. So when you're bringing up concerns about security, that may be more because you're concerned about your status rather than your security. And the Europeans, in my opinion, I agree with this, are completely concerned about their status in a new world order. European elites do not fear an attack on their representative homelands so much as a loss of primacy, in which they have been nestled comfortably for decades as junior partners of the United States. What I'll say is the European capitals, they act as if they don't understand realpolitik power politics. I believe that they do, and they are massively fearful of their status because they understand how power politics works. They wrote the book on it. The reason why they're so concerned is about status, because realpolitik has been reignited by Putin and by Trump at a time in which these states are very weak, that they've become used to living beyond their power politics means, pompously lecturing others about values, heavy-handed interference in internal affairs of third countries, seizing their resources and forcing their markets open, dabbling in military adventurism, as in Libya. In the comfortable shade of American primacy, European states have been able to afford a self-centered, lucrative and at times unscrupulous foreign policy. If the US bids goodbye to its unipolar-era global hegemony, Europeans will lose the stature of vicious primacy and have to start treating states around the world as sovereign equals. So saying that the reason there's this rhetoric is not security concern, it's of a loss of status. But anyone expressing criticism of Europe's neo-Bellicism or proffering alternatives to these precipitous arms races will be sidelined by European opinion leaders and incur ridicule and tirades from politically mobilised and extremely online public. Again, if you disagree with any of this, it'll be a tirade against you from the very top. Between them, they've discovered deterrence and declared it the final word on war and peace. It's lopsided perspective, as if they skipped part 2 of the Introduction to International Relations lecture, where they would have heard about the inevitable result of a deterrence-based strategy in the security dilemma. The Romans coined the phrase, if you want peace, prepare for war. But we're living in what this gentleman, Du Bois, had it right. The cause of war is preparation for war. So when you see a country preparing for war, this can ultimately be the cause of it over the concern for your status. This is why I believe in the future, in the next years to decades, we will once again see friction with other EU states and Germany, as Germany is the state which actually could have dominance upon these states as they rearm. It's not that we've had any evidence of this happening before in the last 100 years. I think we'll see further friction. Do I mean there's going to be an invasion? No. But I think this preparation, if you're a neighbouring state here, you'd have to go, what if this person is elected? What if X? And the cause for preparation for war, plenty of examples of this. And if you were sitting in the Kremlin, you could also say that the cause for this war was we see NATO moving as a preparation for war. After years of fiddling with the dial, Russia and Europe are locked deep in a spiral of mutual escalation. Russian drones and planes encroaching on European airspace are a warning. Conspicuously loud click of the dial after months of loose talk by the European leaders about moving a reassurance force into Ukraine the moment of a ceasefire takes hold. So as soon as this goes, we're moving. And you see this is a death spiral. It's goose in a flat spin heading down in mutual escalation. The loudening drums of war drown out rational debate. In conditions of pervasive militarism, the natural laws of politics is suspended. Whoever points out obvious absurdities gets punished. There are definitely things that need debating. Europe is on course to spend hundreds of billions, perhaps as much as $3 trillion for outrageously expensive gold-plated weapon systems. We talk about this tank, which all up could cost 29 million euros to build, which could be destroyed by a dirt cheap drone minutes after it lumbers onto the battlefield. We've been watching it happen live on AusInt channels. All players of the game of a multipolar great power rivalry are subject to this new devastating cost-benefit analysis. In May, the Americans concluded a ceasefire with the Houthis because squandering pricey planes and ships into a fight against bargain basement drones and rockets launched from one of the world's poorest countries was just not worth it. And this is not bloody publicised well, but the Houthis in that, planes going overboard, there was almost planes shot down as well. The price calculation in this is where Russia had a massive shock in the beginning of this war because everyone else had this 3-day, that was correct given the rationale because we had not seen the effective use before and the efficiency of drones. Weeks later, Russia lost a good part of its strategic bomber fleet in a drone action by Ukraine's security service that was spectacular as it was low cost. And if you don't think that can happen anywhere else, you are kidding yourselves. Who makes all of the electronics, all of the drones? And America, well, Israel with its vassal America, set precedent for the weaponization of these items with the Pages attack. You would not believe the amount of people who called me after that Pages thing and said, this was absolutely shocking to set, with regards to what you think of that attack and the people it targeted, was the precedent it set, who makes bloody half the vehicles now or more, who makes all the drones, all of this, big issues. Does all this mean that instead of arming themselves to the teeth and betting on deterrence, Europeans should lean back and do nothing? Not at all. We need to do a lot of thinking, debating, organising, and work to escape the illogic of militarism, expose arms races as a threat, and though through patient, disciplined diplomacy, put a halt escalation and find peace. Vicarious primacy, courtesy of America descending into white nationalist imperialism, or Europe as a militarist great power clawing for hegemony in Eurasia, are not the only options out there. We Europeans need a better answer to the question of what role we play in the world, which means we deploy to that end. And this is the thing, is the status and what role Europe plays in the world is being upended. And it's not being upended by Putin. It's being upended through decades of incredibly poor decisions being made, from economic to immigration to military as well. That's why they've found themselves in a point of which they know power politics is back on the table. They've found themselves in a very, very weak position. And this is why they're coming up with all sorts of different ideas. But that threat of losing America could be devastating. What I would add to that too is the movement and trajectories of some European states. You could see states moving much closer with a state like Russia than with the centre of gravity of the EU. Legends, long video. Look after yourselves. I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.